picture this. It's July 9th, 1755, and the Pennsylvania wilderness is cooking under a sun that seems determined to melt every piece of metal the British Army brought with them. General Edward Braddock, a man who'd spent his entire career fighting civilized wars on civilized battlefields, is leading roughly 2,000 of King George's finest soldiers through forests so thick that noon looks like twilight. Now, I want you to imagine what this must have looked like. These aren't just any soldiers, mind you. These are British regulars, men trained to march in perfect formation, to fire disciplined volleys on command, to stand shoulder to shoulder while enemy musket balls whistle past their ears. They're wearing bright red woolen coats in 90-degree heat, carrying 60 pounds of equipment each, marching 4 abreast down a trail barely wide enough for 2 men. The sound of their approach, drums beating that steady British rhythm, officers shouting commands, equipment clanking with every step. This cacophony is echoing through ancient oak forests for miles in every direction. What Braddock doesn't know, what he can't possibly understand with his European mindset, is that every sound his army makes is being catalogued by 900 French Marines and native warriors hidden in those trees. Picture skilled hunters who can move through forest without disturbing a single leaf. Warriors who've been fighting in these woods since before Braddock was born, watching these strange invaders who fight as if trees don't exist. The ambush, when it comes, erupts like a series of thunderclaps. One moment there's the steady rhythm of British boots on packed earth. The next moment the forest explodes with musket smoke and war cries that turn those neat red lines into writhing chaos. Officers on horseback, men trained to lead from the front in European tradition, become perfect targets silhouetted against the sky. Soldiers who've drilled for years to form ranks and fire volleys find themselves dying while trying to maintain formation against enemies they can't even see. Among the colonial militia units attached to this disaster is a man who's absorbing every terrible detail, Robert Rogers of New Hampshire. Now, Rogers isn't your typical colonial farmer pressed into military service. This man knows these forests like a gentleman knows his drawing room. Every tree could hide death. Every sound carries meaning. Every shadow might conceal an enemy warrior. Rogers has learned his woodcraft from Abenaki traders during the brief peace before King George's War made them enemies. He speaks their language, understands their tactics, respects their methods of warfare, and right now, Rogers is watching British military tradition commit suicide against American reality. Think about what he's seeing. 900 British soldiers dying not because they lack courage. These men are standing firm under fire that would break lesser troops, but because their honor demands. They stand in bright red coats, firing volleys at shadows. Their training, their discipline, their entire military culture is worse than useless here. It's actively getting them killed. Young George Washington barely escapes this catastrophe with 4 bullet holes through his coat, and he'll spend the rest of his life remembering this lesson about the difference between European warfare and American warfare. But Rogers is learning something different, something more immediate and practical. He's seeing what happens when you try to fight forest wars with parade ground tactics. After the slaughter, and that's what it was, pure slaughter, Rogers begins thinking about the men he knows back in New Hampshire. Men like Jonathan Stark, a trapper who survived Abenaki captivity and came back knowing things no European military manual could teach. Moses Hazen, whose family farm sits right on the edge of hostile territory, who's learned to sleep light and wake fast. Israel Putnam, who once crawled into a wolf's den with nothing but a torch and a musket, because the bounty money meant his family could eat through winter. These aren't gentlemen soldiers with purchased commissions and European military education. These are frontier survivors who understand that honor means nothing to a tomahawk in the darkness. They know that the only rule in forest warfare is staying alive long enough to protect your community. So Rogers begins proposing something radical to British command. What if, and hear him out on this, what if they fought forest wars using forest rules? What if they adopted enemy tactics instead of pretending European methods work in American conditions? What if they moved like natives, struck without warning, took scalps for bounty money, just like their enemies do? You can imagine how this goes over with British officers who've built their entire careers on the idea that there's a right way and a wrong way to conduct warfare, and the right way involves formations and volleys and gentlemanly behavior. The very suggestion that King George's forces should adopt savage tactics makes these career soldiers recoil, like Rogers just suggested they start worshipping pagan gods. But here's the thing about dead soldiers: they can't defend settlements. And here's the thing about burned villages and slaughtered families: they cost the crown a lot more money than wounded pride and moral objections. When the economics of frontier warfare start hitting British accountants, suddenly Rogers' radical suggestions don't sound quite so impossible. Because the alternative, what they've just witnessed at the Monongahela, is watching the finest army in the world get systematically destroyed by enemies who refuse to fight fair. And if you're going to survive in this new world, you're going to have to learn new rules. The question is, how far are you willing to go? How much of your civilization are you willing to sacrifice to save your present civilization? Robert Rogers is about to find out exactly where that line is drawn and then deliberately cross it. Through 1756, Rogers transforms frontier rogues into something the world has never seen before: precision killers who combine European military discipline with native forest craft. His training camp near Fort Edward becomes a forge where two completely different military traditions meet and merge into something new and terrifying. Picture what this looks like. Rogers has gathered men who live between worlds: trappers who speak Abenaki better than English, hunters who can track a deer for 20 miles through virgin forest, farmers who've learned to shoot by firelight because raiders prefer dawn attacks. These aren't soldiers in any traditional sense. They're survivors who've learned that civilization ends where the forest begins. But Rogers isn't just teaching them to be better woodsmen. He's creating a military unit that operates by rules no European officer would recognize. Rangers learn to move single file, each man stepping exactly in the leader's tracks to hide their numbers. Think about the discipline this requires: marching for hours through rough terrain while placing each footstep with surgical precision. One careless step that breaks the pattern and enemy scouts can count your entire force. They practice winter warfare on snowshoes, learning to fight while gliding over drifts that would trap regular soldiers chest deep. Rogers personally teaches tomahawk combat, showing how the weight and balance differ completely from European swords. Where a gentleman's blade requires finesse and years of training, the tomahawk is about brutal efficiency. Bury the blade in your enemy's skull and move to the next target. Rangers waterproof their muskets with bear grease, shorten barrels for forest fighting, carry dried corn and pemmican instead of the heavy salt pork and hardtack that British commissaries insist proper soldiers require. Every piece of equipment gets evaluated by one simple question: will this keep me alive in the woods? If the answer is no, it gets discarded, regardless of what military regulation says. The 28 rules of ranging that Rogers develops aren't gentlemen's agreements about proper conduct in warfare. These are survival instructions written in blood by men who've learned that dead heroes don't protect their families. Listen to Rule 7. If you are obliged to receive the enemy's fire, fall or squat down till it is over, then rise and fire at them. This isn't about maintaining formation or presenting an honorable target. This is about using the ground to stay alive long enough to kill your enemies. Or Rule 19. Let the enemy come till he's almost close enough to touch, then let him have it and jump out and finish him with your tomahawk. Think about the nerve this requires. You're crouched behind a tree while enemy warriors approach, listening to their footsteps, getting closer, fighting every instinct that screams at you to shoot or run. You wait until you can smell their war paint, then you rise up like death itself and butcher them at arm's length. Rangers paint their faces with charcoal and vermilion, not for intimidation, though that's certainly an effect, but for practical camouflage. They wear moccasins that leave no heel marks instead of military boots that announce their presence to every tracker within miles. They carry scalping knives alongside King George's commission, because bounty money puts food on tables back home, and scalps prove to British paymasters that the job got done. British chaplains condemn their souls while British generals celebrate their results. This creates a fascinating moral tension. These rangers are fighting for Christian civilization while adopting pagan warfare methods. They're protecting settlements full of God-fearing colonists by becoming, in the eyes of their own officers, little better than the savages they're fighting. But the results speak louder than moral objections. Through 1757 and 58, French outposts along Lake Champlain start disappearing. Not captured, disappeared. Rangers would strike at dawn, kill everyone they could catch, burn everything that would burn, then vanish back into the forest like they'd never existed. French commanders start pulling back their forward positions because keeping them manned becomes impossible. The psychological impact spreads far beyond the immediate military effect. French allied native communities that had dominated frontier warfare for generations suddenly find themselves looking over their shoulders. War parties that once moved with complete confidence through territory they'd controlled for decades now travel in larger groups, post more sentries, avoid areas where Rangers might be operating. Rogers develops a network of intelligence sources throughout the frontier, traders who note military movements, captured soldiers who provide information in exchange for their lives, even double agents within enemy communities. This isn't the gentleman's intelligence gathering of European warfare, where officers exchange prisoners and conduct negotiations under flags of truce. This is espionage at its most ruthless level. The 1759 assault on St. Francis proves Rogers' methods devastatingly effective. This Abenaki village has launched 30 years of raids against New England settlements. French priests bless war parties that return with colonial scalps, turning this place into a combination military base and religious sanctuary for frontier warfare. Rogers leads 200 Rangers on a 400-mile journey through hostile territory, hiding boats for their return journey, creating false trails to confuse any pursuit. They travel for weeks through country where discovery means death, living off what they can hunt and forage, moving like ghosts through forests controlled by their enemies. The attack itself achieves complete surprise. Rangers strike at dawn on October 4th, catching the village between sleep and waking. Buildings burn, while Rangers pursue fleeing inhabitants through morning mist. The destruction is total, not just the physical structures, but the psychological impact on every native community allied with the French. But victory comes with a terrible price. The retreat becomes a nightmare when enemies discover their hidden boats. Rangers split into small groups, racing winter through hostile country. Some resort to eating leather straps and tree bark. Others turn to cannibalism when companions die. Fewer than half make it back to British lines, but frontier raids against New England settlements drop dramatically. Here's what makes this significant. Rogers has proven that white men can fight better than natives, using native methods enhanced by European technology and organization. The student has surpassed the teacher, and the implications terrify everyone involved. By 1760, Rogers' Rangers have evolved into something unprecedented in military history. White men who fight better than natives, using native methods enhanced by European technology and discipline. Think about what an achievement this represents. These aren't just colonists who've learned to shoot straight and move quietly through the woods. These are professional soldiers who've mastered every aspect of forest warfare and then improved upon it. Rangers like John Stark develop ambush techniques that combine native patience with synchronized firepower in ways that would be impossible without European military training. They'll position themselves in carefully chosen locations and wait motionless for hours, not minutes. Hours until enemy forces move into the perfect killing zone. Then they unleash disciplined volleys with a precision that no traditional war party could match, before melting away into the forest like they were never there. Native warriors, who once dominated frontier warfare, now find themselves outmatched by enemies who know all their techniques yet add innovations they never imagined. Rangers use pocket watches to coordinate attacks across multiple positions. They employ European mathematics to calculate distances and angles for maximum effectiveness. They modify grenades, weapons completely unknown in traditional forest warfare for use in woodland ambushes. But it's the psychological warfare that proves equally sophisticated. Rogers understands that fear is as powerful a weapon as muskets and tomahawks. Rangers begin leaving specific patterns of mutilation as messages. French couriers found scalped, but with their letters intact, sends a clear warning that intelligence lines are compromised. Enemy sentries discovered with Rogers's calling card a crow feather placed in their mouths spreads fear through entire garrisons. Yet Rangers also show unexpected mercy in calculated ways. Sometimes they'll release prisoners with specific messages. Surrender brings better treatment than resistance. Cooperation means protection for families. Certain types of intelligence earn pardons. This unpredictability keeps enemies constantly off balance, never knowing whether Rangers bring death or diplomacy. The sophistication of these operations requires unprecedented coordination. Rangers establish supply caches throughout hostile territory, buried so carefully that they remain undetected for months. They develop communication systems using everything from carved tree markings to smoke signals adapted from native methods. They create escape routes with multiple fallback positions, turning entire regions into operational territories. But success breeds institutional hatred within British ranks. Regular officers despise these provincial banditti who collect scalp bounties, ignore military hierarchy, and succeed where traditional European forces fail. Colonel Thomas Gage actively sabotages Ranger operations, withholding supplies and ammunition, assigning impossible missions clearly designed to get Rogers and his men killed. Think about this dynamic. Here you have colonial fighters who've solved the military problem that's been destroying British forces for years, and instead of gratitude, they receive contempt and sabotage from the very officers they're trying to help. British military culture simply cannot accept that American warfare requires American solutions. The idea that ragged colonials might have military knowledge superior to career British officers threatens the entire foundation of imperial military hierarchy. Rogers spends as much time defending his methods to British superiors as implementing them against French and native enemies. He writes reports explaining why Rangers need special equipment, why they can't follow standard military procedures, why their success rates justify their unconventional methods. British officers respond by questioning his loyalty, investigating his finances, and generally treating him like a necessary evil rather than an innovative military leader. The irony becomes almost unbearable. Rangers are protecting British settlements, destroying French military capacity, and saving the Crown enormous amounts of money that would otherwise go toward rebuilding burned villages and replacing slaughtered garrisons. Yet British command treats them with suspicion bordering on hostility because their methods challenge fundamental assumptions about proper military conduct. This tension comes to a head during the Siege of Montreal in 1760. Rogers' Rangers conduct reconnaissance that proves crucial to British success, infiltrating French positions and providing intelligence that allows conventional forces to position themselves for maximum advantage. But when the city surrenders and victory celebrations begin, Rangers find themselves excluded from the honours. British officers who spent the siege safely behind earthworks receive promotions and recognition, while the men who made victory possible get assigned to clean-up duties. When the French and Indian War concludes in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, British authorities immediately move to disband Rogers' Rangers. These embarrassing reminders that imperial forces required colonial assistance have outlived their usefulness. The official reasoning focuses on budget constraints, but everyone understands the real motivation. Rangers represent a challenge to British military superiority that peacetime allows the Empire to eliminate. Rogers himself faces financial ruin. Years of frontier warfare have left him deeply in debt, and British authorities prove remarkably slow in paying promised bounties and back wages. The man who revolutionized American military tactics finds himself reduced to petitioning bureaucrats for money he's already earned through blood and sacrifice. But the knowledge can't be unlearned. The techniques can't be forgotten. Rangers disperse throughout the colonies, carrying with them military skills that no European army possesses. Some become town militias leaders, others move further west to continue fighting on new frontiers. The institutional knowledge of forest warfare becomes embedded in colonial military culture, just as tensions between Britain and America begin to escalate. Think about what this means for the future. British forces have spent the last 8 years systematically dismantling the only military units that understood American conditions and could fight effectively in American terrain. They've alienated the very colonists who solved their tactical problems and made their victories possible. And they've done this just as political conflicts begin creating the conditions that will lead to another war. The question that hangs over everything is simple. What happens when the students who learned from Rogers face their former teachers in battle? What happens when the empire that rejected American military innovation finds itself fighting Americans who've perfected those very innovations? The answer is coming sooner than anyone realizes, and it's going to reshape not just military tactics, but the entire balance of power in North America. The Revolutionary War erupts in 1775 with bitter irony that would be almost funny if it weren't so tragic. Robert Rogers, the man who taught Americans how to fight like Americans, finds himself caught between two worlds he helped create. Debt-ridden and embittered by British betrayal after the French and Indian War, he wavers between causes, before finally accepting a British commission to form the Queen's Rangers. Think about the psychological complexity here. Rogers has spent years being treated like a dangerous necessity by British command, subjected to suspicion and sabotage by the very officers he helped save. Now those same authorities are begging him to use his expertise against former friends and neighbors. The empire that tried to destroy his rangers when peace made them inconvenient suddenly needs rangers desperately when war makes them essential. But here's where the irony becomes almost unbearable. Rogers' former protégés now lead American forces. John Stark commands at Bunker Hill, using tactics Rogers taught him to destroy British regulars. Israel Putnam becomes a Continental Army general, applying lessons learned in French and Indian war forests to revolutionary battlefields. The teacher finds himself facing students who know every trick he taught them, every innovation he developed, every weakness in traditional British military thinking. At battles like Bennington, American Rangers use Rogers' own tactics to systematically destroy British forces. They position themselves in carefully chosen terrain, wait for enemy forces to commit to disadvantageous positions, then unleash coordinated attacks that combine precise firepower with rapid movement. British officers who survived the French and Indian War watch in horror as colonial forces execute maneuvers that seem impossible, until they remember that these same colonials learned these techniques fighting alongside British forces against French and native enemies. The Continental Army doesn't just adopt Rogers' 28 rules of ranging, they improve upon them. American commanders like Daniel Morgan develop rifle tactics that enhance Ranger innovations with new technology. The famous double envelopment at Cowpens represents Rogers' ambush principles applied to conventional battlefield warfare. Francis Marion's operations in South Carolina take Rogers' small unit tactics and adapt them for guerrilla warfare that makes British occupation impossible. Rogers himself descends into alcoholism and irrelevance, fleeing to England after the war where he dies in 1795, forgotten and impoverished. The man who revolutionized American warfare ends his life as a London drunk, dependent on charity from former enemies who barely remember his contributions to their earlier victories. It's a pathetic end for someone who fundamentally changed military history, yet his tactical innovations live on through every American conflict that follows. Civil War cavalry raiders like John Mosby study his manual, adapting forest warfare principles to agricultural terrain. Nathan Bedford Forrest's operations behind Union lines represent direct evolution from Ranger tactics. Both sides in that conflict develop special forces units that trace their organizational principles directly back to Rogers' innovations. World War II brings even more dramatic vindication. Army Rangers train using principles Rogers developed 2 centuries earlier, though adapted for modern warfare. The famous assault on Pointe du Hoc employs tactical concepts, small unit coordination, specialized equipment, achieving surprise through unconventional approaches that Rogers would immediately recognize. OSS operatives in occupied Europe use intelligence gathering and sabotage techniques descended directly from his forest wisdom. Vietnam presents the most direct parallel. Special forces learning jungle tactics in Southeast Asian terrain follow modified versions of Rogers' rules. The emphasis on living off the land, moving undetected through hostile territory, building intelligence networks among local populations, conducting psychological warfare alongside kinetic operations. All of this represents direct lineage from Rogers' innovations in 18th century forests. Modern Army Rangers still memorize modified versions of his rules, though sanitized for contemporary sensibilities. The language changes, we don't talk about taking scalps anymore, but the underlying principles remain constant. Move quietly, strike without warning, use terrain to your advantage, gather intelligence continuously, maintain operational security at all costs. These concepts form the foundation of modern special operations doctrine, but the deeper legacy remains troublingly complex, and this is where we need to confront some uncomfortable truths about what Rogers actually accomplished. He succeeded by teaching white Americans to fight like the indigenous peoples they were simultaneously displacing. This represents cultural appropriation for military purposes on a massive scale, adopting native warfare methods, while rejecting native claims to the territory where those methods developed. Rogers created not just military doctrine but cultural archetype that continues to shape American mythology. From Daniel Boone to Navy SEALs, the ideal American warrior blends civilized technology with what 18th-century observers called savage tactics. Rogers established the template: the American who wins by any means necessary, who adapts enemy methods without accepting enemy values, who preserves civilization by temporarily abandoning civilized restrictions. His Rangers proved that survival sometimes requires becoming what you fight against, a lesson both empowering and morally ambiguous that echoes through American military philosophy today. We see this in everything from Vietnam-era free-fire zones to modern targeted killings. The idea that existential threats justify adopting enemy methods becomes embedded in American strategic thinking at the deepest level. Consider what this means for how Americans understand warfare and their place in the world. Rogers taught us that military effectiveness trumps moral consistency, that tactical innovation matters more than traditional honor, that winning requires adapting enemy strengths while exploiting enemy weaknesses. These lessons became foundational to American military culture in ways that still influence decision-making today. By teaching Americans to fight like Americans, he made British military dominance in North America impossible. The empire that rejected his innovations when they were inconvenient found itself facing those same innovations wielded by enemies who understood their full potential. Rogers didn't just help America win independence, he made American independence militarily inevitable. And perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for Robert Rogers and his Rangers. They didn't just change how Americans fight, they changed what it means to be American. The willingness to adapt, to innovate, to abandon traditional methods when survival demands it, to become temporarily uncivilized in defense of civilization. These characteristics that Rogers embodied became permanently embedded in American national character. Whether that's a good thing or a dangerous thing depends entirely on your perspective. But there's no denying that it's a lasting thing, and it all traces back to those forests of colonial America, where Robert Rogers first decided that survival mattered more than honor and effectiveness mattered more than tradition. The question for us today is simple. Are we still following Robert Rogers into the woods, even when we don't realize it?